Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Thick Slices and Deep Cuts. Tonight's episode, we're not ranking, but we're doing a theme of old school Swedish death metal. Just one of these things that I feel like I have a lot of knowledge on because I got into death metal about 91, and there was a specific band that we're listening to right now called Entombed. They got me into it, and after Entombed, I kind of just found all kinds of bands on the Earache and Roadrunner and Nuclear Blast labels and other labels, Century Media. But Entombed was sort of the gateway into the Swedish sound. So I'll go through it. Well, before I go into the Swedish guitar sound, the big four of the Swedish scene were Entombed, Dismember, Unleashed, and Grave. And there's one band that I understand why they're not in there, but they definitely need to be cited as one of the big or original five. And that would be Tiamat. Obviously, their sound changed, and by the end of the decade, they moved on to other things. But I think Tiamat is critical that we mention them. And also a band, Carnage, who started out, it was like, for the album that they did in 1990, 3/5 of the band was what would become Dismember. The bass player ended up in Entombed for a split second, and the guy that ran Carnage, Michael Amat, ended up leaving Carnage for the classic Carcass stuff of necroticism and even Heartwork before forming Arch Enemy and taking that to where we are today. But one other thing I want to say. So getting into the Swedish sound, the big studio, and not everybody recorded there, but the big studio and the big sound was Sunlight Studio, and the producer was Thomas Skogsberg. And I don't know if he came up with it or if the Dismember or Entombed guys did, but they used this heavy metal HM2 pedal, and I have one, and you crank everything to 10. This one's made in Japan. I think they made these in Japan like 83 to 88. And then they started making them in Taiwan, but I heard that those aren't quite as good as the originals in Japan. I can't get the Entombed sound. I can't get that Swedish buzzsaw sound out of this. It's just a muddy mess. I wonder if I need a noise gate to go with it. And I'm using it through this like old Marshall Valvestate Chuck Schuldiner amp. So maybe that's part of it. But I still think that the amp should be good enough. I just think maybe I need a little bit of a noise gate to keep it all together. But anyway, there you go. That's the pedal they used. I heard that the guys from Dismember have like dozens of these laying around. So they're like a collector of them. Anyway, well, let's get right into it. So, again, not ranking anything, but I guess if I had to rank, I would just say Entombed. They have these two classics. Left Hand Path was recorded at the end of 89, came out in the spring of 90, and I mean, we're listening to the title track now. Absolute classic song. But Life Goes On, Better Loss, just everything, Supposed to Rot. I mean, everything on here. Revel in Flesh. It's just awesome. The late LG Lars-Goran Petrov is the vocalist here. These guys, this goes so far back, you think these guys are so old, and then you look at their ages, and they're not much older than me. I mean, they were like 17 when they were doing this. So the Swedish death metal sound was just basically created by these like high schoolers, basically. I mean, everybody that was doing the classic stuff was 17, 18 when the first real albums came out. So, but man, if you had to ask me, I think Clandestine is probably my favorite. It was the first one I heard, and it's just so well done. These two are classic, and I just feel like in a songwriting sense, they perfected this sound that started here. But these two are just probably the two best of the entire old school Swedish scene. Entombed owned both of those. I don't have the Crawl EP. I used to have it on cassette. You try to buy it now, it goes for a ton of money. But I do have this compilation that has all the stuff from that. So they re-record Better Loss, new song Forsaken, and Crawl, which would end up on Clandestine. So bit of a mixture there. Two different versions of songs that you find on the two classic albums, and one song you can only find on the EP. This has some other extra tracks from their whole 90s era. So this is cool. I heard this. They were partially major label here. I mean, this is Earache, but I think it was also on Columbia. This was Hollow Man EP, and this came out in '93, and I was pretty worried and disappointed. So LG Petrov comes back into the band, but these songs on here I was not not liking. This was the beginning of what's known as Death and Roll. I thought Carcass did the Death and Roll a little bit better. And then they came out with Wolverine. These two albums are from the same recording session. So the full-length Wolverine Blues came out in late '93. I warmed up to it a little bit more over the years. I remember when this came out, I was colossally disappointed. In fact, I really didn't like this album. But over time, I Master's cool. Demon's awesome. Rotten Soil's all right. Contempt, it's okay. It's a little more punky and Death and Roll, but it's as far as I went with Entombed. Their first 3 full lengths in this EP, and obviously the stuff on here, the extra tracks that you can find on here. To me, that's the Entombed that I'll stick with. Is pretty much everything they did from the beginning to about '93, I guess. And they also, by the way, they were also, before they were Entombed, they were Nihilists. So they were doing demos in the late 80s with Thomas Skogsberg. They were just doing EPs or demos. And Johnny Hedlund of Unleashed was their bass player when they were Nihilists. Then they, I guess when he left the band, they changed their name to Entombed and immediately went to the studio and recorded a full length. Well, that segues into Unleashed. So Johnny Hedlund left and formed Unleashed. I'm into their first 3 albums. I've heard their other stuff since, but back in the day, I basically got everything they did, Where No Life Dwells, Shadows in the Deep, and Across the Open Sea. Those are the first 3 were the ones I dug. This one even has In the Laughter Has Died in the demos. If I had to rank these, I'd just go there. This first one's my favorite from '91. The first one, a lot of these cases with this old school Swedish death metal, the first thing they did is the best thing they did. Or the earlier the better. 90, 91 to me is like the prime time for all this stuff. And this was 91. Shadows in the Deep was the first one I heard. I love Shadows in the Deep too, but it's my number 2. The production's changed big time for Across the Open Sea. It's very dry sounding. No effects, just real dry. But I warmed up to Across the Open Sea over the years too. It's classic. But for me, the first one's great. The second one's great. Third one's pretty good too. Unleashed are great. They're so consistent. Throughout their career, you know what you're going to get for the most part, but they're still consistently good every time. Also, when I call old school Swedish death metal, I'm basically talking about the early half of the 90s, up through 95. You can kind of be a little vague with that year, but old school Swedish death metal to me is everything from the beginning to 95. So Unleashed is one of the big 4. Let's see. We can't talk about the early buzzsaw sound without mentioning Dismember. I mean, like an ever-flowing stream for '91. Again, Thomas Skogsberg producing. By the way, Unleashed did not use Sunlight Studio. They went to Germany and Voldemort Sorajka, that guy who's done a lot of work for a lot of different bands, especially on Century Media like Asphyx and Tiamat and some other bands. He just gives you a really good production. He gives you a real clear, clean production. Whereas Skogsberg gives you just this messy but brutal buzzsaw, classic Swedish sound. And you're getting there. Look at the band photo, covered in blood, bullet belts. Override of the Overture. If this podcast goes long enough, you'll hear that song. I also got Indecent and Obscene with the Pieces EP, but they gave you the Pieces cover. But I used to have Indecent and Obscene on cassette back in the day, and that's the actual cover. And apparently they said it was supposed to be Jim Morrison on the Doors. He's doing this thing on one of the Doors albums. Well, they made a mockery of that with Indecent and Obscene from '93. And you've got, that's the Pieces cover from '92. It was an EP. There's them looking. Just remember they were going for the disgusting gore thing. I like how they re-record Torn Apart in '92 on Pieces. They re-record Torn Apart on Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. Oh, and for good measure, it was a Carnage song from 1990. This is one of my favorite albums, Carnage, Dark Recollections. If you ask me what my favorite Dismember album is, I would just tell you Carnage, Dark Recollections, even though it's not Dismember, it kind of is. And this is Carnage right here. There's Maddie Karki on vocals, Dismember. Fred Espy on drums, Dismember. David Blomqvist on guitars, Dismember. Johnny Dordovich went on to Entombed, or at least he was in the band photo. Michael Amott, he's your main guy. He goes to Carcass for the classic Carcass stuff, and now he's doing Arch Enemy stuff. But this album is awesome, so classic. I mean, for me, the top 3 most classic albums of the scene to me are right here. The first 2 Entombed and this Carnage. And if you want to push it any further, I just go, okay, that first Dismember. They all have that Sunlight Studio production. So awesome. So Dismember to me they're probably the second most popular band of the big 4 after Entombed. I'm going to guess Unleashed is the third most popular. And speaking of the fourth in that group, Grave. Into the Grave from 91. I'm going to say Into the Grave is my favorite album of theirs. They're probably my 4th favorite of the big 4, but they still have that classic Swedish sound. They're going to Sunlight Studio as well. They're nasty. They sound like, if you like Dismember and Entombed, just get Grave. If listening to Entombed and Carnage and Dismember isn't enough for you, especially the first Dismember, that Carnage album, the first 2 Entombed, if all of that Sunlight Studio from 90 and 91 isn't enough for you, get this one from 91, Into the Grave. It's my personal favorite. Here's a twofer. It's basically You'll Never See, but it's got And Here I Die Satisfied on there, which was an EP. There are those covers. They're cool. They basically recorded almost everything they did in Sunlight Studio through the 90s anyway. Eventually, Grave would do what a lot of these bands did, and by 94, they're doing the death and roll thing, or at least they're doing the groove. And I'm not a huge fan of the album Solace or the one after it, Hating Life, which is really different vocalists. It sounds completely ungrave-like. But the song Solace is awesome. It's probably my favorite song from them, but it's not terrible. It's okay. I remember being disappointed when this one came out, but after seeing what had happened with Wolverine Blues and Entombed, I wasn't totally surprised that the sound was shifting. And by 94, the sound of death metal and everything in general was shifting quite a bit. But Grave, another cool band that totally fits into early, old-school Swedish death metal. Speaking of the band that got left out here, we're listening to Tiamat, Mountain of Doom from the Astral Sleep from 91. I think this is recorded with Baltimore Sorikta too, like Unleashed. But I love it. Tiamat may not be part of the Big Four, but they might have been the first band to make the scene. As Treblinka was their name in the 80s when they were doing demos, just like Entombed was Nihilist. Those were maybe Dismember or Carnage. Those were like the early. That was the earliest. Oh, and Grave was called Corpse. They were doing it too. So all of these bands were kind of there in the very beginning. So creative, so atmospheric. I love early Tiamat. It's the best stuff. This is an awesome, underrated album from 91. Again, 91, great year. Clouds might be their best thing in 92. So atmospheric, so different. They were ballsy, they were bold, they took chances, and I think it works. And then they just kept on evolving, and this is my personal favorite, 94. Wild Honey, wow. So well done, so atmospheric, just so almost ambient, still hanging on to I guess it's death metal, it's some sort of a heaviness. Probably has more to do with black metal at this point, folky black metal, but still awesome. And I'm ashamed that I don't own their first album, Sumerian Cry from 90, but when you hear the song Sumerian Cry at the end, that tells me I gotta wrap this up, I'm running out of time. So I did put it on here. But Johan Edlund and Tiamat, they recorded, even though they do their recordings elsewhere, like in Germany with Voldemort Sorikta and elsewhere, they did do their demos as Treblinka in Sunlight Studio, and they did Sumerian Cry in Sunlight Studio with Thomas Skagsberg, and even though it came out a month after Left Hand Path came out, it was recorded in October of '89. It was the first full-length proper release to be recorded in Sunlight Studios. So Tiamat's very early work was recorded with that classic Swedish sound. So if you want to hear Tiamat in that classic sound, go get Sumerian Cry. It's a cool album. Again, I'm ashamed I don't own it. I need to buy it and have it. So for this era, we're talking about the early half of the 90s up through 95. I think Tiamat just was awesome. They were, I think, the first ones to get there. And their trajectory was incredible. They did an album in '97 called A Deeper Kind of Slumber that got more industrial electronic, probably more so than anything, and kind of gothic. And I think it's a well done album. It's not completely what I'm looking for. It's not completely up my alley, but I can hang with them all the way to that. I feel like their creative arc ends after their first 5 albums. After that, they turned into something that their audience, they weren't playing music for people like me at that point. They were playing for a different kind of audience altogether. But still, Tiamat's awesome. These 3 are classics, and I think you can say Sumerian Cry is a classic because it was recorded in sunlight. It's the first full length ever recorded there. And it's just awesome and dark, and it's got some of the atmosphere that they would carry on everything else. So yeah, just the big 4, really the big 5, and Carnage I lump in there too. So Entomb, Dismember, Unleashed, Grave. Don't forget about Carnage for sure, and don't forget about Tiamat. I mean, those bands were there in the beginning. Here's Unleashed, Into Glory Ride from Where No Life Dwells. Awesome. I love Unleashed. But there were other bands in the scene. I'm going to showcase a few of them. Let's see. Let's start with one of these bands that goes back. I would say if you were going to add another one to the big whatever, Hypocrisy. So this is Peter Tägtgren. I got this re-release of the first 2, but in case you aren't sure what the covers are, Penetralia, cool artwork. And this was the first one I heard from them, and I liked it. I'm not sure where they recorded. I know Peter Tägtgren, the main guy in the band, did a lot of the recordings himself, but this wasn't done in Sunlight Studios. Osculum Obstinum, probably. I don't know which one my favorite is. I think Penetralia. I think Osculum Obstinum is the one I listen to the most because it's so sick. It's in my opinion, it might be their heaviest, sickest album over Penetralia. And then I got this box set where they re-record some. It's got greatest hits, but they re-record some of the early stuff, like the song Penetralia, The Fourth Dimension, Osculum Obstinum, Apocalypse, a few others on here. But since you can't see the Fourth Dimension cover from '94, I did have it on cassette back in the day. That's the bass player, Michael, wrapped up in duct tape in a chair. This was a shift in their sound. They had, I forget the guy's name, the singer who was on the first 2, and he was great and guttural. Well, he left the band, so they were reduced from a 5-piece to a 4-piece. They were reduced from a 5-piece on Penetralia to a 4-piece on Osculum Obstinum. Then he leaves, they're down to a 3-piece. And so Peter Tägtgren's now your vocalist. So the sound is a lot different, and the recording quality is different, and this is a lot more slowed down and atmospheric. So Fourth Dimension saw a big shift in the band after those first 2 albums. And I didn't care for this much when it first came out, but now I think this is a pretty cool album. The Fourth Dimension, don't forget about that one from early, old school Swedish death metal. So I always dug Hypocrisy. In fact, I even have a newer one from, I think, '09, A Taste of Extreme Divinity. It's my favorite of the stuff they've done post, the early '90s, post those first 3 albums. But Hypocrisy's great. Who else? Oh, I love this band. Here's another band that recorded with Thomas Skogsberg in Sunlight Studio. At least for their first 2. I did not get their 3rd album because it was like something else, but their first 2 are classic. Desultory. So this didn't come out until I think '93. So they were a little late to the game, but I think they've been around for a while doing demos. But Desultory with Into Eternity. This is an excellent album. Classic Swedish Sunlight Studio, Thomas Skogsberg sound, but all these songs are catchy and memorable, as well as being heavy. I'll say this, they don't blast. Everything they do is death metal, but it's like the thrashy, mid-paced type of stuff, which is cool. They sound great, the production's great. I always thought these guys were a little underrated, a little overlooked, but they were on Metal Blade. Here's Grave. I think the song's called Hating Life. Not to be confused with the album titled Hating Life, which came out years later, which sounds nothing like this. There's that. There it is. heavy metal pedal. And then Bitterness, I don't know which one's my favorite. I like these two for different reasons because they're kind of different, but it's still totally desultory and it's still that classic production. I think I like this one the best, but I think this might be even more mature. And all this stuff's good. So these first two are just classics. I'm glad I got these re-releases with slightly new cover art, similar to the old cover art though. But the desultory were cool. Oh yeah. I don't know if I have. See if I can find pictures of these albums. They're in such small print. But anyway, Edge of Sanity. Edge of Sanity. Dan Swano, who, by the way, produced a ton of bands and engineered a ton of bands back in the day while being a kid himself. But Edge of Sanity, I always thought were cool. They were kind of progressive. They would experiment. They would take chances. But you know, I remember when I joined Time Duel and Jeff was listening to this album Unorthodox, and it came out blasting away, and then they just stopped on a dime, and then Dan Swano goes from growling to singing. And their keyboards and the whole thing. I'm like, I didn't think you were allowed to do that in death metal at the time. And then Spectral Sorrows from '93's classic. Nothing But Death Remains from '91. So they were there early on. Until Eternity Ends, Purgatory Afterglow. After that, you're getting out of the early days and into the latter half of the '90s, which my personal favorite albums are the Crimson and Crimson 2 albums. I thought those two were big concept, progressive albums, but those were beyond the early old school Swedish days. But the first three, Nothing But Death Remains, is just classic, like just pure death metal, traditional death metal, but Unorthodox might be their coolest album, and Spectral Sorrows is probably my personal favorite. I think that's Dan Seagrave artwork. By the way, there's a lot of Dan Seagrave artwork that permeates the old school Swedish stuff. Certainly the Entombed and that first Dismember, and the Carnage album and all that stuff. So yeah, Edge of Sanity's great. Let's see. More Entombed. I had to get more Entombed on here. I guess I better speed it up. So there's a poster behind me. These guys are closer to, got a little bit of black metal Dissection, but they're black and death metal, and the riffing is total. This was produced by Dan Swano. Dissection, Storm of the Lights Bane is one of my favorite albums. Somberlane's awesome too. They're classic. They may have nods to black metal, but I think that they're black and death metal. They're from Gothenburg, so they sort of had that more melodic thing going on. So these songs are just so memorable. This album is perfect. This is a perfect album. I just, John Northbeat, who, went to prison, and then eventually they came back to the third album years later, and then he, is no longer with us. But these two albums are so classic. I had to include them. So this album's one of the best. So Dissection gets a nod here. And let's see, what else? Oh, At the Gates. I really only like one of their albums from back in the day, but they put out 4 albums in this time frame known as 90 to 95. And the one they put out in 95, this is sort of like the last entry along with Storm of the Lights Bane. Slaughter of the Soul. This changed the game for all this music moving forward. Thrashing in 3/4. I'd never heard bands thrash in 3/4. And they got a new production with Fredrik Nordstrom, who will go on to produce, Opeth and stuff like that, and tons of other bands. But At the Gates, they were doing the classic Swedish death metal thing early on, but then right here they pivoted and revamped their sound. And then I saw them tour twice on this album. Once they opened for Morbid Angel with Dissection in early '96 off of the Domination tour. That was an awesome concert. And then they came back around like just a matter of months later. I think it was opening for Napalm Death. And then they broke up. Now they're back. But At the Gates I thought I had to give a nod to. They snuck in. Like I said, this is late in the game of what I would call old school Swedish death metal. All right, let's see. Some bands I wanted to give a nod to that weren't Swedish, but had that sound. The most obvious one that comes to mind, Amorphous from Finland. These first 2 albums, they had an EP in there too, and which are the bonus tracks on here. But the Karelian Isthmus and Tales from the Thousand Lakes are both really cool albums. And this is my favorite that they ever did, but this is great too. But these were recorded in Sunlight Studio with Thomas Skogsberg. And even though these guys are from Finland, I mean, if you didn't tell me where they were from, I would just assume they were Swedish. Because these albums are very Swedish sounding death metal. But I will say this, the Finland, you know, the lyrical concept here, the Kareli Nismus, this has to do with Finland. You know, it's real Finland geography there. And there is a certain folky quality that all of those Scandinavian bands have, but there's a little bit of a folky quality here that kind of makes you go, okay, so that's what the traditional folk sounds of Finland are like. But yeah, these albums are awesome. This one has a lot more going on with like some keyboards, some different things. But these two albums, to me, a lot of people love Amorphous to this day. For me, it kind of stops after this sound. The other stuff is okay, but to me, this is what I want to hear when I want to hear Amorphous. So I had to give a nod to them from Finland next door to Sweden. Oh yeah, from Norway, the first Dark Throne album. Dark Throne is known as being one of the like classic black metal bands of all time, out of Norway, right? Of course. Their first album was produced in Sunlight Studio with Thomas Skogsberg. Sounds total death metal. Doesn't sound black metal. Sounds total black death metal. Neptune Towers, Grave with a View, The Watchtower. And I think it was either co-produced or there's a nod to Ufi and Nika from Entomb. So you're thinking, you know, in Hammy from Peaceful. This is on Peaceful Records, but this is total death metal. You would not know that 1 year later and to this day they would be just complete underground like black metal, because the first Dark Throne album is classic death metal. Even though they're from Norway, they're getting produced by Thomas Skogsberg in Sunlight Studio with the help of the guys from Entomb. So the first Dark Throne I had to mention. That's my shout out to Norway here. We got a shout out from Finland, shout out from Norway. How about Denmark? How about Conqueror? This is total buzzsaw. This is total Sunlight Studio. This is groovier. This is 94, 95. But this is total Sunlight Studio, total buzzsaw guitars. This is actually produced by Fred Espy of Dismember and Carnage, and executive produced by Thomas Skogsberg. But this is a little groovier. It's a little later in the old school game, but this has a total Swedish sound to it. So I think we've covered all the main countries of Scandinavia there. We hit Finland, Norway, Denmark, with Conqueror. How about this one? Disharmonic Orchestra from Austria. What a cool country. I'd love to go there someday. They're so eclectic and experimental and progressive. Look, they're holding teddy bears, for crying out loud. They're a three-piece death metal band. They're holding teddy bears. But they went to Sunlight Studio to be produced by Thomas Skogsberg, and they get that buzzsaw sound here. So when you listen to this, Disharmonic Orchestra are their own thing. I mean, their first album was short songs, total grind, like Carcass, like Symphonies of Sickness or something. But their second album was total buzzsaw, old school Swedish sound, but with their own total wacky, goofy experimentation. I love this album. You'll never hear another album like this, but I always love not to be unconscious, not to be undimensional conscious. Not to be undimensional conscious. Cool album. Here's a newer band. I'm just throwing this in. Volcandra. This came out in the last 10 years. But it's the guy, Stefan, from Obscura down in Munich, Germany. But this is a total tribute to Dissection. It sounds just like it. In fact, they cover the somber lane at the end. But it's total Dissection worship to a T. We got to speed it up here. Who else? This Eyes of Death compilation's cool. You've got Tiamat recording songs from the Astral Sleep, but it's with Thomas Skogsberg in Sunlight Studio, unlike the ones that were released on the album proper. Grave recording, but not in Sunlight, recording in Germany, so you get songs on the first album, but recorded differently. And Unleashed is on here with demo songs. General Surgery is on here. That's another band to give a shout out to from the scene. Who was on here? Oh, Afflicted. Their first album is really cool. But Tidings from the Blue Sphere, they're very wacky, kind of 70s. They'll do anything. They're cool. I think that's pretty much it. I think just to give a quick nod out since we're running short on time, I mentioned Afflicted. Their first album is really cool. Prodigal Son. Very strange band. Their band photo makes them look like they're from the 70s, and they kind of have that coming in. They got weird sounds going on, acoustic guitars and strange synths. Carbonized, cool band. More of that Entombed sound. Cemetery, unanimated, sounds just like Dissection, sort of that black and death metal thing. Merciless. Oh, Necrophobic's first album is classic. Therion's first album before they changed into symphonic metal was recorded at Sunlight. General Surgery. Furball. Your band's name is Furball. Comic-Con. When LG left Entombed between albums, he recorded with Comic-Con in Sunlight Studios. Then he went back into Entombed. Well, when Martin Van Drunen was removed from Asphyx, he recorded in Sunlight Studio. The great Martin Van Drunen of the Dutch Asphyx, he recorded the second Comic-Con album, which, by the way, I need to buy that because I love everything Martin's on. And then the third album they did in Sunlight Studio in '95 was with Mark Grew of Morgoth. And I love early Morgoth too, so that was cool. Here were some of the bands I didn't really showcase because I feel like they're known for what they do more in more modern times, or at least post '95, but may have been around then. Arch Enemy, they're more of a modern band. Bloodbath, total, kind of like Phil Kandra. Bloodbath is total worship of old school death metal. You've had Dan Swano, the guys from Catatonia, Michael Ockerfeld of Opeth, Martin Axelrod. Speaking of Catatonia and Opeth, those bands were around during this time, but I just feel like Opeth's totally known for what they've been doing the last 20 years, as opposed to what they did in the early half of the 90s. Same thing with Catatonia. They did an album recorded by Dan Swano. Opeth's early albums were recorded by Dan Swano too. Catatonia did an album in '93, but I feel like their sound didn't develop until after this period of time. In Flames, I can't say I'm a huge fan, but they were big after this time. They were big probably in the later '90s and early 2000s. Dark Tranquility, I can't say I ever got into them. I don't know if I like them or not. I never really listened to them all that much. But they were around a little bit during this time too, and they're still going strong to this day. So I think that covers it. And this is my cue that we're about to run out of time. Sumerian Cry by Tiamat, which started it all. So I think that covers what I consider to be old school Swedish death metal. So thanks for watching. I hope this was entertaining, and I will see you next time.